The Tyranid Hive Tyrant has got to be one of the most recognizable kits Games Workshop has ever made. And it's probably the single character that has gone through the most iterations in Games Workshop's history. There was the ultra retro second edition Tyrant, the definitely not a big warrior Tyrant, the dragon-like winged Hive Tyrant from Forge World, the baseball of pewter metal Hive Tyrant, and finally, the plastic Hive Tyrant. And I must say, the plastic Hive Tyrant is perfect. But that doesn't mean I want a regular old run-of-the-mill perfect Hive Tyrant, because I like a little something about every single Hive Tyrant that has ever been made. I like a little bit of the retro, and I like all the spines and the spikes of the modern. And I want to kit bash the bejesus out of this kit, because my Hive Fleet Behemoth deserves an extra special character. I've been sitting on this kit for forever. I'm not even sure where I got it. It predates my Leviathan Tyranids, and it's finally time to assemble them. I cut all the parts off the sprue. Even though I'm not building the Winged Hive Tyrant, I might need his bits. The normal Hive Tyrant has a hunchback look. Still impressive because of how massive he is, but I want a big S shape to make him taller and more animal-like. And to pull this off, I'm gonna use his flying feet, so his stance is wider. Also, something funny about the winged feet, it's a Russian nesting doll of hooves. It's just hooves all the way down. I cut these off, and now it just looks like a normal foot. I wanna change up the tail. I wanna have it curve upwards over his body, and to do this, I need to heat up the plastic. I put poster tack over the detailed bits, as these will heat up and melt. Once the tail was soft, I bent it up, and you can see the exposed scales got a little singed, but the details under the putty are still nice and crispy. Now for the body. I need to make his tiny little belly much longer, so I cut off his crotch and shoved a big old brass rod in there. Using some pliers, I bent it into shape, and I did the same thing for his head. I think I got something here. I got some curves going. Real Tyranid have curves, especially the Neurolictor. Although this guy has some pretty gnarly gaps I gotta fill. His whole back is made up of 4 pieces, and there's a seam in between each segment. To fill gaps like these, I like to use Tamiya plastic putty. I scooped it up with a toothpick and poked it into the seams. This stuff dries softer than plastic, so it's easy to sand off. And while I'm working on the back, I was thinking about messing around with the smokestacks. I took some painter's tape and put these over his spines, and I poured some UV cure resin and cooked it. Once I took off the tape, I had extra long spines. I did the same on the front stacks, and now each spine is about double the height of the last one. This worked surprisingly well. I thought the UV cure resin would glue itself to the tape and I'd have to sand it off, but it peeled right off. A little sanding and it was perfect. Now to give him a base. Since I'm using the flying feet, he needs to be standing on a bit of an angle, so I made up a leaning pile of cork, sticking it down with hot glue. I picked away at the flat surface of the cork until I was left with a big messy pile, and I filled in any gaps with Tidy Cat's cat litter and ultra thin super glue. To make my ground, I used milliput, squishing it into the cork, leaving some of the cork showing for a rock-like texture. And I squished down the milliput with more cork to press in a rough texture and to get rid of my fingerprints. Now I can attach him to the base. He's so big, he needs pins in his feet, so I used some paper clips. The Hive Tyrant. Now that he's standing like 2 inches taller than he should, which isn't great for gameplay, but for being awesome, it's fantastic. He's gonna tower over the rest of my Tyranid army and be much more imposing. Although speaking of imposing, he doesn't look that imposing right now because he's got a limp piece of spaghetti sticking out of his head. I gotta fix that. Now that he has a long neck, the big old brain head doesn't look right. Luckily, his mouth is a separate piece, so I can use that, and for his head, I have an extra Zoanthrope head. This piece is huge and much more reminiscent of the 3rd edition Hive Tyrants. With my pieces picked out, it was time to try my best at sculpting. I mixed up some green stuff, I have a factory fresh tube, and I mixed the 2 halves together and got started. I put the green goo over the brass rod, getting it into the rough shape of his belly. And once I had something, I used a silicone brush to smooth it out and get rid of my fingerprints. Then I took this sculpting tool, which is a ball and a stick, and started making little trenches. Luckily, the Tyranids are very bioorganic, and the organic part is helping me a lot. Things can be a little rough and still look okay. After making a million little trenches, it was starting to look like a proper Tyranid exoskeleton. I stuck his torso together and gave his belly a slight turn to the right. It's looking like an empty corn cob. Now onto the head, and I have less of an idea of what to do here. Before I was re-sculpting the old belly, now I have to invent something. I made a line down the middle and added a small hose on the side. This matches up with his jaw, and then I made a bunch more ridges. It kinda looks like the Xenomorph's inner mouth. A little bit of this top will be visible under his head armor, so I made some scales with my silicone sculpting brush, making shovel-shaped indents, and then I glued down his noggin, giving him a creepy tongue. After 8 hours of drying, I glued on these new pieces, and he is standing. I glued on his last little claws, the one on his tail, his nipple spines, and his toenails. He is a very snaky boy. I definitely like him more than the original kit, but he does look weird. I think it's because his head, even though his head's way bigger than the original kit, it feels smaller because of that long neck, but I dig it. Now it's time to figure out those weapon options and to magnetize or not to magnetize. Swarmlord and Hive Tyrant are both pretty good, so I do want the option. I think I gotta put in some magnets. The heavy venom cannon is the better of the two guns, so that's the only one I'm gonna worry about right now, and I have a lot of options for the sword arms. I could go with the classic bone swords and lash whip, but it feels wrong on this guy. Then there's the classic four swords, but I also have some Carnifex talons. These would give them a more animal appearance, but I feel like they're a smidge too big. Swords it is. For magnets, I always like to use the biggest I can get away with, so I grabbed some 5mm by 2mm disc magnets and started drilling holes. I sunk my magnets, and these are probably the cleanest, most perfect magnet connections I have ever made. And of course, I got the polarity wrong. So I had to massacre the arm to get the magnet out and flip it the right way around. Always double check your double check with magnets. It's a real bummer when you mess up. I changed up the angle of the venom cannon, so I need to change up the tube. I blasted it with the heat gun and bent it so it fit, and now it's rock solid. After that, I glued on the upper arms into place permanently. So I just had a duh moment. I've been having a heck of a time trying to get the magnet just right on these ball jointed limbs and getting the angle just perfect. After magnet number 4, just figured it out. I've just been guessing on where the magnet should go, but if I put a drop of paint in the magnet and then hold up the arm exactly how I want it, it leaves me with the perfect dot showing me right where the magnet should go. I sunk in my magnets and now all the arms are available to me. Now to finish off the base, I glued down some epic basing bits, alien creep on the floor, and some clumps of Alocasia odara plants. And I covered the ground in texture paste. After that, I covered the floor in glue and sprinkled on coconut husk, which looks like dirt because it pretty much is dirt. And I glued some rocks down on top of that. I let the base dry overnight, and I was kind of nervous that the coconut husk would be really fragile, but it's on there pretty darn good. Lots of wood glue, lots of matte medium. That did the trick. Now that this little noodle is all done, it is time to turn him into my Swarmlord. He's pretty hard to handle, and it's awkward to hold onto his 60mm base, so I took some double stick tape and I put him onto a tin I had lying around, and this made it much more comfortable. I primed the base black and sprayed black from underneath, then sprayed white primer all over his body. I masked off the parts I don't want to blast with red paint, like his gun and swords, and then I base coated him. This red lays down super bright on top of the white and is darker over the black primer. I pulled off the putty and sprayed some earth brown over his bone weapons, then finished him off with some tan. Now for his royal red wash. I covered every bit of red. In some spots, like his belly and neck, I did 2 coats to get them darker. And I put skeleton horde contrast paint over his weapons. Now shading red is kinda tricky. I want him to have shadows, but I don't just want dark red. I want the finished product to be bright, so I mixed together some purple, red, brown, and black to make a slightly darker and different shade of red. I used this to shade the recesses, painting it onto the underside of all his fleshy parts. Then I highlighted, picking the tallest, pointiest parts of his skin and laying down the original red. Then red mixed with a little bit of orange. After that, red mixed with more orange. Then just orange, and then a tiny dot of warm white right in the middle. This little bit of highlighting makes a massive difference. Red is a really tricky color to work with because it's so specific. You add white to blue, you get light blue. You add white to yellow, you get light yellow. You add white to red, you get pink. So you can only highlight so much, but at least for my Tyranid, I found little highlights of orange let me get those crispy details while still having an overall red complexion. Now for his armor. I made up dark blue and base coated all of his carapace. This is the only downside of Tyranids. They're really quick to paint, but there's no way of getting around picking out all of the armor bits. Then I painted Leviathan blue contrast paint over the blue. Once that was dry, I started painting on a million little lines of blue, highlighting each edge of the armor. This is only step 1, so it's okay to be a little sloppy with my lines here. On his smokestacks, I sponged on 3 layers of blue paint, a dark, a mid, and a light color, so there's a transition from the bottom to the top. I took the middle and light color I used for sponging and highlighted all the carapace, painting smaller, finer lines over my blue lines. This is to give the impression of texture, and I did a final highlight of some light blue, doing this only in a few spots to draw attention. Now he's very black and very blue. I want to even him out a little bit, mixing in some of my original blue with some fluorescent blue, which I could not get out of the bottle. I glazed this over the carapace, making him much more blue. Dabba-dee-dabba-die. That blue looks really good next to the swords. Oh, the 4 bone swords look so cool. 8 attacks, hitting on 2, strength 9, twin linked. This guy got the drop on some Deathwing Knights. He'd give him a run for their money. Probably overcosted at 270 points. He has a lot of really good abilities, but man, is he a blender. And speaking of those bone swords, I gotta finish them. Bone is one of the easiest things to paint. I darkened the bottom of each blade with some more contrast paint, and while I waited for that to dry, I base coated his other horny bits with tan. Then I got out the dry palette and mixed some tan and white together, and I dry brushed this concoction onto the top halves of each sword, and onto the venom cannon. Then I did just a little more dry brushing with pure white to make the blades pop. Now to pick out some of the extra details, with one of my all-time favorite colors, Army Painter Gilly-Doo. This is the perfect sci-fi green color, and I put this on the little slits of his venom cannon and on the poison sacks hanging off each sword. And you know what else has hanging sacks? That's right, our Patreon. We have monthly terrain packs. This month, it's the Crash Spaceship, the wrecked bones of an impressive gothic vessel that your armies can fight over in narrative-driven games. And if you always want to be up to date on the goings-on at Eons of Battle and be entered into our monthly giveaways, this month we're picking 3 followers to receive this month's terrain and 1 to receive this pack physically, printed by Only Games. Follow the link in the description below to sign up to our newsletter. Now it's all about that base. I airbrushed white paint where the red spilled onto the plants, and then sprayed some watery brown over the dirt. Then some watery green over the plants and some of the ground, and then I finished it off with neon green. This color is so bright and looks great next to the red body. Then I painted the rim of the base black with my favorite Apple Barrel Gloss Black. My little swarm's got a lord! I am now a Tyranid player, but barely. I got Leviathan, got it done in a week, all those models, lovely. And then I've just sort of been tinkering with it. I finished a squad of Zoanthropes, and I've played Tyranids a few times in Tabletop Simulator, but the momentum definitely stopped. But now that I have my HQ, my Warlord choice, the model that will be present in every single battle, I feel that snowball starting to roll again. High Fleet Behemoth, the first of the Tyranids to land in the Milky Way galaxy, nearly destroyed by the filthy Ultramarines, but still a strong tendril of the Hive Fleet. With their lord now present on the battlefield, not Nyx's Blue Orcs or Sean's Imperial Guard can stand against the might of the Swarm. And as for the Tyrant himself, those that have tasted the bite of his poisonous swords named him Noodles.